We are starting in the book of Daniel, and we had one preliminary study that we did, but this is our first one that will actually be in the book of Daniel. And this is a book that should be serious for Christians and Jews to learn what it is that God has to say here. That doesn't diminish the other books of the Bible, but if you don't understand the book of Daniel, there are a lot of other books in the Bible that you're not going to understand. So much of the Old Testament deals with the future, and that's exactly what the book of Daniel does. We treat the book of Daniel very much like it's a child's book. We know the story of Daniel in the lion's den. We know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And we kind of treat the book as that's what it's all about. But it's much, much more. Many of the prophecies in the book of Daniel are fulfilled. Many of them are not fulfilled yet. They're still to come. The supremacy of God just glows through the book of Daniel, and we need to see that. Today's study will be still somewhat introductory, but we will actually be in the book of Daniel, but it introduces the book, the great adventure that we're going to go on as we study through the book. We will ask many challenging questions of you and of your church. But I want to provide enough background that we understand the situation. I hope that we will reveal not only the world of the past, but the world of the future. God promised a land to Israel. Remember, the promise to Abraham of a land was an unconditional promise. Unconditional. That land belongs to Israel. But when he came along to Moses and the people of Israel, he gave an if clause in there. They could live in the land if they followed his commands. Now, I saw a news reel on the attack of October the 7th in 2023. It was a sad thing, and it was totally unnecessary that it went on. But that music festival, they seem to have a large statue of Buddha. Folks, that's not what Israel is supposed to be about. They're supposed to be introducing the God that created all and who established Israel as being his people. Anyway, unfortunately, the nation of Israel and our nation operates in cycles where they'll worship God, cycles where they'll worship some idol or something like that. But God's promise to his people was that they could live in the land as long as they followed his laws. They agreed to do that while they were there in the desert and almost immediately forgot it. But Israel imagined God's blessings as being from man's effort. Folks, we do the same thing. Anyway, they wanted to turn to a more friendly, human-friendly style of worship. Same as today. People get excited about whoa kind of worship and not about understanding their God and really worshiping him. Not that there's anything wrong with being emotional about loving our God, but they in Israel turned to the fertility gods. And folks, we do the same thing. But they would worship a god that led into sexual perversions. And their worship turned to fulfilling man's desires instead of actually worshiping God. Now, they didn't have Planned Parenthood in their days, but they had a god called Molech. Molech was a god that the people would take their babies, their full-born babies, and Molech, they would build a fire in his belly that would, he had arms that would reach out, and these arms would become red hot, and they would place their babies, their live babies, in the arms of this, screaming as it rolled on down into the fire and was consumed. Horrible, horrible. But again, in cycles, they would worship God and worship him appropriately. As they did that, he would bless them. Then man's desires would come in and they would be worshiping other gods. Now we turn to Daniel's time. That was all before Daniel and continues even today. But in 1 Kings chapter 13, we have an unnamed prophet who prophesied that there would be a king coming to Judah, coming to rule Judah. His name would be Josiah, which means foundations of Jehovah. And, it's important that we understand these names because they represent something to us. But anyway, with that, many years later, that prophecy was fulfilled. Josiah was born, and he lived up to his name. He took over from his father and grandfather, who were idol worshipers, and really pushed that type of worship. Josiah worshiped Jehovah. Now, he took over as king when he was only 8 years old, but he didn't really start pushing his leadership toward Jehovah until he was 18 years old, which is understandable. Anyway, he had the temple remodeled and repaired, and as they did, they found a copy of the law, and they read that to Josiah, and he started having idols destroyed. The priest who led in idol worship, he had put to death, and he aggressively destroyed idol worship in the land. So he is considered certainly a good king. Josiah tried to do right, unlike his father and grandfather. And I suspect that Josiah was influenced more by his mother's side of the family. His mother's name was Jedediah, which means beloved, and she was the daughter of a guy named Adadiah, which is adorned of Jehovah. We read that in 2 Kings chapter 22. But it sounds like Josiah was greatly influenced by his mother, and he wanted to live up to his name, foundation of Jehovah. When the law was read to Josiah, he tore his clothes. That's a sign of mourning. He mourned and became aggressive about stopping idol worship. Daniel probably lived during part of the time that Josiah was the king. But Josiah died. His two sons became king. One of them, the first one, Jehoahaz, and he only ruled for 3 months and was taken off the throne, and his brother was put in there. But both aggressively undid everything that Josiah had done. They immediately led back into idol worship. America has succumbed to the worship of evolution. Homosexuality is being pushed on our children. The concept of man being created in the image of God has lost its meaning. Abortion is honored. Men think of themselves as gods. Daniel was taken into captivity, that was Babylonian captivity, between 608 and 604 BC. Now, I believe it was about 605 BC, but some push 606, some push 608. Anyway, right in that time frame. And we'll specify the reason that I believe the date of 605 later. Anyway, in the last chapter, Daniel was in Babylon until the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. That means that he was in Babylon for at least 70 years. And he lived a rather normal lifespan. He would have probably been a teenager when he was ripped away from his family and taken there to Babylon. But I want us to consider the teens in our country. Daniel went in there, and I want you to listen as we study these verses that we're going to study in the first chapter of Daniel. Daniel stood up to what he knew about his God, even in captivity, even in the college that he was sent to. But many of our youth go to college and are turned away from the Lord. He was moved out of his home. And what happens when our kids are moved out of their home? Does their faith just crumble? Even consider our high schools and junior highs and below. How well does our church prepare our kids to stand up to the reality of God? How relevant is God in their lives? Will their faith survive even through college? And I suppose I should ask the question about your faith. How well has it stood up through the years? And how does your faith survive on Mondays and Tuesdays? How well does it survive after you've been to church? Anyway, it's important that our lives demonstrate our faith in God every day of the week. Believe me, I have asked this question about my life. And do you really believe in heaven or hell? Are you really expecting Jesus to return? And yes, my God and your God are our judge. Yes, your judge is God. And your kids judge you. The rest of your family judges you. How important is God in your daily life? How important is God? Is church an important thing for you? Now, I'm just introducing the book of Daniel to you. You're getting kind of an idea here as to what we're going to be studying in this passage that we're studying today. But I'm not going to be able to give you a nice tight answer as to how you accomplish all these things. But we've talked about Josiah and how he lived and how his kids failed. Do our kids fail like that, or are they going to fail like that? The only answer that I can give is to live and teach. My judge is God. And you're going to understand what I'm talking about here in a minute. You can't force these things down a kid's throat. You can't force them down the rest of your family's throat. But if your children are going to believe that, you've got to live it. You have to win them to that. But if you push too hard, they'll hate God. If you don't push enough, they'll hate God. But people who really believe in the Lord and love the Lord, it will glow through their lives. And I think that's what Daniel must have had in his family. We don't know anything about Daniel's family in Jerusalem. We only know about him once he got to Babylon. But I want you to watch as the Babylonians try to demean everything in relation to his former life, and see his response and evaluate how his family must have been. Now, we're going to, I should have been going through and showing you these names, but these are the names that we just talked about. Daniel's name means "my judge is God." Now, there's some scholars that say it's turned around backwards and should be judge of my God, or my judge, or judges of my God. Now, that fits somewhat into chapter 2, and so I won't demean either name there, but I like the name "my judge is God." And from there, we're going to go through the outline that we have here. Inferior leaders. Now, understand what I'm saying here. These are the way things look, not necessarily the way things are, but inferior leaders, inferior God, inferior training. So let's go into Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. I hope you have your Bible. You're going to need your Bible in this, because I am not going to display the things that are from the book of Daniel. I want you to see those for yourself in your own Bible. I will display the words of the verses that are outside the book of Daniel. But here in verse 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it." Remember, Daniel's early life was under Josiah, but he was also evidently under the King Jehoahaz and King Jehoiakim. Josiah pushed the getting rid of idol worship, but his sons, as we've told you, just didn't. Anyway, evidently, Josiah had very little influence over his sons. He had 2 wives, and the 2 sons that ruled were from different mothers, and that shows you a problem right there. Anyway, from there, we want to move on and consider Daniel. Daniel was a young man when Josiah was probably killed by the Egyptians. And the Egyptians had asked Josiah if they could pass through his land. They wanted to go and join a war that was between Assyria and Babylon. And Josiah was promised by God that he could live a peaceful life. But Josiah chose to go into battle and stop the Egyptians from going through. And he was immediately killed in that. And when they took his body home, first of all, the Israeli people put Jehoahaz on the throne, but the Egyptian king within 3 months, changed that and put his brother on the throne, or his half-brother. So let's go into the next verse there in the book of Daniel. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, that was the king that the Egyptians had put on the throne, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his gods, that is, to the Babylonian gods, and brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. God didn't protect Josiah. Josiah actually, I believe, violated what God told him he wanted him to do. But he was a king that was trying to get rid of idol worship. But neither of his sons caught that. God rescued Israel from Egypt, but and Egypt didn't protect the people there. Anyway, Babylon took over Israel and took the vessels out of the temple and carried them to Babylon and put them in the house of their God. That makes it look like God was inferior. Now, that's not the case, and you're going to see that as we go on through the book of Daniel, that God was certainly not inferior. This all fit into the plan of God. Anyway, they took his vessels that were used to worship in the temple, and they took them to Babylon and put them with the things of the gods of Babylon. Excuse me, I'm trying to see what I was trying to get through here. But there are many things that they did to Daniel there. The prophet that I told you about earlier that prophesied the coming of Josiah prophesied that they were going to be taking the princes of Judah and making them eunuchs. Now, that's probably what happened to Daniel. And I heard a pastor this week, actually it was last week, heard a pastor last week say that only 2%, that he estimated 2% of the people that go to church really are serious about their God. And I think that's probably true. I don't know how I could back up that. But sometimes we teach books like the book of Daniel, and it sounds like a Santa Claus story. Folks, we need our kids to understand, my judge is God. That's what Daniel understood. And even if you call it judge of God, now that of is possessive, so it would be God's judge. And certainly Daniel became God's judge in the land of Babylon. But that puts man kind of in first place when we say God's judge. But I want you to remember Moses brought the people across the Red Sea. And they could say Moses did that. But that's not true. It was God that did that. No man can lift the walls of water on each side. But he had to demonstrate that the water was indeed deep by the Egyptians dying there. God is going to demonstrate himself in Babylon, even though it looks like He's inferior. It looked like he was inferior because he led the people of Israel in Moses' time up against a place that they were trapped, and the army was coming after them. Then he opened the waters. Well, that's the way the book of Daniel is going to be going as we continue with it. I really look forward to getting deeper into the book of Daniel. I have taught the book of Daniel a number of times, and each time I teach it, I learn more and more and more, and I get more and more and more amazed at our God as to what he ultimately did. And he tells us that in the book of Daniel. I would like for us to go to the book of Ephesians, just still talking about how our kids can stand up in the situations they find themselves in schools. It says, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil." And continuing on, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore, take unto you the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand." Now, I know that I'm asking serious questions. In Daniel's situation, could we stand? Would our children stand? The captors of these young people were Babylon, and we're not Babylon, or we're not dealing with Babylon, but it says there in Ephesians that we battle against principalities, against powers, against rulers of darkness of this world. Folks, those things exist right now in our world. Very much so, they exist in our world. And I feel that this book is one that gives us great clues as to that. Think about Noah. Noah was there in a time, and how many people got on the ark with him? He preached for 120 years. How many believed him? 8. Oh my. Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot lived in Sodom and Gomorrah, and the Lord led him and his family out. And his wife turned back. She wanted what was behind her. But God destroyed that city. And all of us are under this if clause. America has seen blessings for many years. But folks, America continues to live under an if clause. There's still more challenges. Let's move on in the book of Daniel. Verse 3, "And the king spake to Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes." Daniel was one of the king's seed in Israel, and he was one that was taken in that early deportation. Let's go on into verse 4. "Children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning and knowledge and understanding science, such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and tongue of the Chaldeans." Now, we see here that Daniel would not have been just a dumb kid. He was there on a scholarship. In America, it would have been to Harvard or to Yale or to one of those schools. He was going to the most prestigious schools. But if you keep up with the news today, you know that those places are not exactly places of pristine teaching of things of the Lord. Anyway, they're teaching socialism and homosexuality. My own high school in my own city here, my kids were being taught that homosexuality is equal to heterosexuality. Now, I wrote a letter to the school board. Immediately when I found that out, I wrote a letter to the school board, and they sent me back to the principal who was authorizing all of this stuff. Anyway, that went essentially nowhere, but I had to do some real teaching to my kids so that they knew that there was certain requirements that the Lord had. And in Daniel's time, we see there were always ideas of war in the Middle East, just as they are today. In Daniel's time, it started out with the Assyrians. Of course, we know they came to Jerusalem a number of years earlier during the reign of Hezekiah, another godly king. And the Lord turned them away, and they were able to, Judah was able to last another 150 years beyond the rest of the people of the northern tribes. We talked about the division there in our last study. But anyway, the Assyrians, the way they handled their, let's call it their immigration policy, was they scattered people so that they were not with friends. They couldn't join together and form an army to attack back at the Assyrians. But the Assyrians were brutal people. They pulled people away with hooks in their mouth and their lips and their tongues, and they drug them to these various other places. Babylon had a different approach. Yes, they crushed opposition, and they worked to assimilate the people into their society. According to Josephus was a Jewish historian shortly after Jesus' time. Anyway, he tells us that in the first group that the Assyrians took into captivity, and that's just what we were reading about, where Ashpenaz was to go in and bring out some of the youth that could stand in the king's palace. They took 3,000 of the brightest. The next group came a number of years later. Group 2 had, and he gives us a very exact number here, 10,832 craftsmen and youth that were taken in the second deportation. And then what they did, they had men that they had trained. That's what they were doing to Daniel, men that they had trained to be leaders. And then they brought the guys that would set up businesses and so forth, the craftsmen. Then finally, a number of years later, they brought in the general population. That is, they brought in those that they felt would help the land to prosper. But Daniel was part of that first group. And as we study in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel was part of the second group, and Jeremiah was left in Jerusalem. Later probably went to Egypt. Let's go back to verse 3 in Daniel. And the king spake to Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, in verse 4, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning, and in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and tongue of the Chaldeans. Now, the Babylonians, again, were going to train these, and that's what they're going to do with Daniel. They wanted to corrupt them to where they had no Jewish ideas. That didn't work with Daniel. Anyway, they were training them to be leaders and debaters. They wanted them to be recognized as scholars in the land. And that way they could be spokesmen for the king. And I hope you understand that plan from the Babylonians. And I guess it worked pretty well. The Babylonians then, we see in verse 5, and the king appointed them a daily provision. Now this is the first group. This is Daniel's group. He appointed them a provision of the king's meat. That is, they could eat in the king's cafeteria. That's quite a deal for a POW. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now, recognize what he's doing. He's bringing them in, and he's treating them very well because he wants them to be leaders that he can trust. He's treating them well. He's giving them the king's meat, which we're going to see is a problem. But he taught them the literature, math, history, science, foreign language. While they were learning, they were to eat the same food that the king had. And they were fully on government scholarship. They didn't have to end up with a student loan. They had their room and board, their books, their classes, all of it was for free. They probably didn't even have to make their own beds. But there were 3,000 of these, but we only know about 4 of them. We only know about Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Anyway, they were pampered. They didn't have to worry about a career. Their career was all planned for them as to what the king had for them when they finished their training. Going on into verse 6, now among them, and just like I told you, and now among them were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I'm guessing that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were probably roommates, college roommates during this time. They don't seem to acknowledge the rest of the 3,000 very much, so I don't know how close Daniel was to them. But going on into verse 7, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave the names. Oh, listen to this. Unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave the names, for he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, to Azariah, Abednego. Now, unfortunately, we know their Babylonian names better than we do, except for Daniel. We know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are the Babylonian names. Now, let me tell you something. The names that they came into Babylon with, notice the El, Daniel, Daniel. That El means God. Azariah. That IAH is part of the name of God. Mishael, you see the L on the end of his name. And Azariah, you see God's name. Well, they took all that away, and they named them Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which were after the names of the Babylonian gods. They wanted them to forget this Judaism stuff that they were raised under. They wanted them to forget their families. They wanted them to forget where they came from. But Daniel's name seems to be remembered for all those 70 years. One of my early Hebrew classes, with all Jews in the Hebrew class, and they insisted I ought to have a biblical name. So they named me Shmuel, which is in English Samuel. I didn't mind that. He's a good prophet and judge. Anyway, they wanted them to forget all of the things that related to their former life. But in the book of Daniel, it may just be because Daniel wrote the book, but all through the book of Daniel, we see the name Belteshazzar only twice. And we see Daniel 23 times. So the attempt was to get them to forget all that, but evidently they didn't forget it very well. So let's go on into verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. Folks, can our kids go to college and purpose in their heart that they're going to continue to follow God? Daniel purposed in his heart. That big 3-letter word, but, turned the whole situation around. They tried to make Daniel forget all that was in his former life, but Daniel had learned too well. His national leaders were defeated. It looked like his God was defeated, but this training did not pull it out of him. It was inferior training. God had not protected his nation. I'm sure Daniel prayed about that. It didn't work out the way Daniel wanted it to. But Daniel still trusted in his God. My judge is God. The temple vessels of God were in the Babylonian house. Why should he be trusting the God that looked like he was weak like that? Well, he did. And we're going to see that it's all fit into God's plan. They could not defeat God, even though it looked like he was inferior. It really bothers me. I believe once saved, always saved. I believe that Jesus holds us in his hands once we're saved. But I've seen kids grow up, and as they grow up, they turn away from the Lord. They've walked the aisle, they've prayed the prayer, they've committed to the Lord. And I believe the proverb that says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. But I've got a couple of kids and grandkids that I'm still worried about. And I know other Christian families that have kids that they're worried about. The Babylonians, though, tried to pull it out of Daniel, It didn't work. Daniel purposed in his heart to hold on to the things that God had promised. They couldn't break him, and that worked to his advantage. Don't talk quite so much about salvation in the Old Testament. It's there. It's all through the Old Testament, but we don't talk as much about it. But Daniel knew his God, and maybe his family were believers, but we must believe that the final credit goes to God. Let's read verse 8 again. It says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat." By the way, the king's meat would have been offered in sacrifice to idols, and that's the reason Daniel didn't want to eat that. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore requested he of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Daniel's new schooling was declaring the gods of Babylon. But Daniel was a Jew. His judge was God. No big protest. He didn't carry any signs. No big civil unrest. And he didn't call this prince of the eunuch names just because he was a eunuch. But he simply requested to remain a Jew, even in captivity. Still under God, despite all that the Babylonians tried to do and tried to convince him otherwise, he knew that even in this forced captivity, God was holding him in his hands. And folks, that's the way I believe God holds us in his hands. And I hope you'll see as we get on through this how it paid off, even in captivity. Daniel refused the king's food right there to start. We know an idol is nothing. Daniel knows that an idol is nothing, but Daniel didn't want to compromise even in appearance. He wanted his God to be remembered. Now, I want us to remember that Daniel saw both good and bad in the leadership of his nation. Even the leaders that made mistakes, he saw what these things were. And I don't know anything about Daniel's parents, but they evidently got it across to him that his judge is God. Daniel, we know he caught it somehow from his family, or somehow in relation to God. And these people in Babylon couldn't force it out of him. We don't know Daniel's exact age, but he was probably a teenager. But God didn't let him go. Therefore, despite the mistakes that Daniel saw all around him and the challenges that he had before him, his encounter with God was real. They tried to demean God, but they couldn't demean it in the eyes of Daniel. God was not operating in this world with a big hammer, and he doesn't do that today, but things are under his control. He allows room for us to grow. Some of these problems come on us, and they are for our growth. They are for making us stronger. Anyway, most of Israel were a broken group. Jesus encountered failures in relation to people that seemed to believe in him. Remember the day he fed 5,000? Very next day, those 5,000 walked away from him. They proclaimed him king as he entered Jerusalem. And then by the end of the week, they walked away from him. They saw miracle after miracle that Jesus did. They ate his miracle. What could be more real than that? One day, Jesus healed 10 lepers. And he told those lepers to go show themselves before the king and before the priest, And only one of them came back to thank Jesus for what he had done. Their bodies were healed, but the majority of them didn't give him credit. Still, one caught it. And I want to go to Ephesians 6:13. It says, "Wherefore, take unto you the whole armor of God." That's what Daniel did. "Take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done so, and having done all, to stand." All that we can say is that God said, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." I'm still praying about mistakes that I made as a parent, hoping that it didn't destroy the training that I intended for my kids. But we know that Daniel caught the training. Nothing that Babylon could do, even the heathen college, could teach or destroy his home training. God was holding Daniel in his hand. Romans chapter 10, verses 9 and 10 gives us a terrific promise. "That if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation." Remember Abraham. Remember that he took his son and was going to offer him at the direction of God. Of course, God stopped him and provided a ram for the sacrifice there. But it tells us in the New Testament that Abraham believed in the resurrection. He believed that God was going to raise Isaac from the dead. And indeed, he did. But do you practice knowing God at home? Do you practice knowing God in your daily life? Do you practice knowing God in your church? Now, I am convinced that this will be a great book and we'll study some great things. But these things have to get in us. We need to be practicing them daily. My judge is God. We've got to learn, or we will learn, a great amount about God. This is a fast-moving book. We'll see it really jump into gear in the second chapter. We got a little bit to go before we get into the second chapter, but we'll really see it jump into to action there. But we'll continue with some of these questions in our next study, and we'll see God in action. We want to see these questions answered in our lives. That if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart. This is something that's deep. It's not just some surface thing. It's not just saying, I believe in Jesus and that's it. It's really believing it in our heart, like Daniel did. And when they want you to be something else, purpose in your heart. Purpose in your heart that you will not defile yourself. Thank you for being with me. I hope you're saved. Thank you very much.